Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Carolina Weather Group. We're happy to have you tonight. It's Wednesday, March 20th, 2019. This is show number 270, and we welcome you to the program. Tonight, we're going to be talking about tsunamis. Next week is Tsunami Awareness Week, and you're thinking, like, what? Carolina's tsunami? Well, we're going to talk about that. The threats of tsunamis are around the world, but is the East Coast included on that? So that is something we're going to talk about tonight. We don't have our guest with us right now, but our guest is Kevin Miller. He works for the California Emergency Services Office for the Governor of California, and Kevin is in traffic right now. Imagine that in California. So he'll be joining us in just a little bit. But we are live broadcast tonight, so we'd love for you to follow along with us. You can do that on Facebook Live, Periscope, and on our YouTube page. If you'd like to interact with us, maybe send us a comment or question, you can do that. Just push the comment on those platforms, and we'll be able to monitor them throughout the show. And if you have any questions or comments, we can address them that way. And if you're listening on the podcast version, we'll let our guest towards the end of the show talk about how you can reach out to him on social media or on a website and get more information about our topic tonight. So we're going to again be talking about tsunamis, and Tsunami Awareness and Preparedness Week is next week, the last week of March. So looking forward to talking about this cool topic tonight with Kevin Miller, and he'll be along with us here in just a little bit. But before he joins us, I'm going to toss it to James Brierton. And James, you've got some news to share with us.
Yeah, we got all sorts of news happening, and I'm actually going to start by popping up radar here across the Carolinas just to let everyone know we do have a few showers, few areas of heavy rain moving across the area. No severe weather tonight, although, you know, this rain kind of made it cool in some place, only topping out in the 40s today in the Triangle, and that was a bit of a change of pace from where we've been. If you're like me here in the Charlotte area, you've been making sure you keep up with the allergy meds every day, because today is the first day of spring, and certainly nature seems to have caught on to that and trying to ward off those allergies, and luckily doing so far pretty well on that. We had some breaking news this afternoon. We're going to roll some video footage here from Florida and Georgia. Hurricane Michael in October of 2018. I'm sure you remember it well, along with Hurricane Florence. The names Michael and Florence being retired from future use on tropical storms and hurricanes. The devastating storms, as you recall, loss of life throughout the southeast and destruction in several communities, particularly in the hardest hit areas of Florida, where Hurricane Michael came ashore, nearly wiping out some towns as a near Category 5 storm. And then we also, of course, had Florence here in the Carolinas in September, came ashore and just kind of moved very slowly as a hurricane and eventually a tropical storm over us and led to region-wide flooding. Well, the World Meteorological Organization announced today that those names will no longer be used for future storms. They're being retired and replaced with Francine and Milton, and I think that was pretty much to be expected. We were just waiting for that official word to come on down, and now we do have it. On last week's show, we told you about the big storm moving over the central part of the United States. It came with several names, the bomb cyclone being one of them that picked up a hashtag and usage in the national media. Well, it was our own Chris Jackson who made a very good point that not only was it going to be a big flooding event, but also one that had some serious impact on agriculture, farmers, ranchers. Well, they're trying to clean up and figure out what to do. They got several inches of rain last week on grounds that were too saturated to handle it after a long winter with snow, and now they've got even more rain on the way. So they're trying to figure out what the economic impacts of this are and what the next steps are. Let's take a listen to some of this new video we got in today from Nebraska.
Right now, where our feedlots are just going through this horrific storm that we just had, and amongst many other feedlots and feeders and cattlemen across this state that was affected. But it's a loss of performance. The cattle are tired. They get sick easily. It really adds up quite a bit, and it's really hard on the people that work there and take care of it. Been a really, really tough deal. But there's so many other producers that even have it worse yet, trying to find their cattle and get to them and things like that. So there's multiple stories across this state of the devastation. What we really want to try to accomplish is it is a process to get federal disaster into this state and get it started. The biggest difficulty we have is, like, if the comment was made, if a tornado comes through and an hour later you can see the devastation, you know what it is. It's so hard at this point in time right now because we may not know for weeks the full extent of the damages.
And And that's exactly right. It will be a little while longer before we know the exact extent of the damage. And you can see in this video here that they're just trying to repair the infrastructure, as the military now coming in to assist with repairs in the communities. And I think what we're looking at here is a video of sandbagging after several dam failures and roadway failures. They're just trying to get a handle on all of this water. And you can see that here in this video, because we've got more rain on the way, and this is not only an event isolated to Nebraska, but we have flood warnings up and down the entire Mississippi River Basin, because now all of this water has to flow south before eventually entering the Gulf of Mexico. So it'll be another week or so before this is all said and done. And just take a look at these satellite imageries. Look at that very well-defined waterway on the left side of the screen there, and just look how it swells on the right-hand side. And some of this is farmland, but some of this is also communities that are being impacted. And so our thoughts are with all those folks out in the central part of the United States that are continuing to recover from this as this disaster continues and is ongoing. Shifting gears now, take a look at this video. North Carolina native flying on the International Space Station tonight. NASA astronaut Christina Cook arrived this week in a launch and docking that you saw right here on the Carolina Weather Group live channel. Christina, along with NASA astronaut Anna McClain, who you can also see there on the left-hand side of your screen, are scheduled to perform the first all-female spacewalk on March the 29th. That will also be on our live channel. Now, Expedition 59 here, one of the last flights that the United States is hoping to hitch with the Russians
Nick
to
Hague
and from
of NASA,
the
the next one through the hatch,
because that SpaceX program is coming together, and we're hoping that in the not too distant future, we'll be able to launch ourselves from U.S. soil to and from the International Space Station. Well, special congratulations going out tonight to the Charlotte Douglas International Airport here in Charlotte on their achievement of becoming a storm-ready community, seen here being presented with that certification by the National Weather Service in Greenville, Spartanburg. That is certainly good news. I will be flying out of there in a few weeks, and you've seen it in the airport there and in other places as well, too. They have those storm shelters that are designated so that if severe weather is ever coming through the area while you're in the terminals, you've got a place to go. Speaking of severe weather, we've been covering this for the past several weeks here on the Carolina Weather Group, but the recovery from those deadly tornadoes that ripped across the southeast some 2.5 weeks ago, when we've been focusing a lot on Lee County, Alabama. You'll recall there that they lost 23 lives in those devastating storms. Well, our friends at the Sirens Project, they're an Atlanta-based storm chasing group, loaded up their equipment and organized a drive of supplies and drove them from Atlanta down to Lee County. They sent us this video to show us how the recovery efforts are ongoing. we will be talking to the Sirens Project coming up in about half an hour right here on the Carolina Weather Group to learn more about their trip down to Lee County, Alabama, and the recovery efforts that they saw and participated in. But for now, it's 8:31. Let's bring back in Scotty Powell and the rest of the Carolina Weather Group panel. Scotty?
Thank you, James. Looking forward to the interview tonight with the Sirens Project. Just some great relief efforts going on down in Georgia and Alabama from the tornadoes, and looking forward to hearing from those folks who were just recently down there and was able to experience the damage firsthand and also talk with the folks who were affected by those tornadoes. So we'll get to that towards the end of the program. But right now I want to bring in our guest, Kevin Miller. He works for the California Emergency Services Office. It's currently in Burbank, California tonight. So Kevin, welcome to the Carolina Weather Group. We appreciate you joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're happy to have you. So our first question that we normally do with our guests whose first time is, how did you get involved in tsunamis? I mean, what is the story with tsunamis, hurricanes? How did you get interested in this particular field?
That's a good question. Well, I got into emergency management through earthquakes. Actually, I live in Northern California, but I ended up moving down here to Southern California to work on the Northridge earthquake. And at some point, one of my boss started talking about there's this tsunami group, and I said, "Are you I thought he was kind of crazy, but it turns out that any coastline in the world could be impacted by this, including ours in California, and we're in the Pacific Basin. There are a lot of earthquake threats, and so it's something that a national group started working on, looking more at back in the 90s. And as soon as we started looking at it, I became interested, and so it's something that I have taken some of my combined emergency management experience and GIS mapping analysis experience to work with this group.
Well, I know we're coming up on Tsunami Preparedness and Awareness Week, and so before we get too involved in our topic tonight, for those folks who may not be familiar with tsunamis or may have just seen them on TV and news stories and things like that, can you tell us what exactly a tsunami is?
Sure. Tsunamis are basically, they can be large or small, and they are some abnormal movement of the water, almost always caused by earthquake, which moves enough of the ocean floor to displace water and send a pulse of water to some shoreline. And those could be from a distant source for California, which would come from Japan or Alaska, from around the Pacific, or from a local source if you are living in one of those places like Japan, Alaska, or even the Pacific Northwest.
Hey Kevin, so I wanted to ask a question. Are there different types of tsunamis? You mentioned they primarily come from earthquakes, but I think recently we had one that was kind of a underground landslide. Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yes, they can. Like I said, it's anything that displaces water. So a landslide could also displace water, and we find that those earthquakes that happen can also trigger landslides, whether it's under the surface of the ocean or next to the ocean that falls into the ocean, and that kind of triggers a landslide. And kind of there's somewhat different threats in that earthquake-triggered tsunami generally needs these subduction zone faults that dive beneath the continent and snap back and kind of trigger land movement, as opposed to something like the San Andreas Fault that slides back and forth or slides adjacent to itself or another fault. Those don't generally move enough or cause displacement of the seafloor to move water. Similarly, if a landslide occurs, that is going to move water. The difference is with a earthquake fault generating a line of water coming towards us from someplace like Japan or Alaska, is that we do have that line of water that could impact the entire coast, whereas something like a landslide is more like dropping a pebble in a pond and it sends ripples outward, but it's not going to affect the entire coast, probably just what has happened, something close by. but these are tricky things in that we don't know necessarily where those landslides might occur. And so it's hard to know which particular section of coast would be impacted.
So I have a question for you, and I know this is something that gets brought up a lot, especially there was an event at the end of December in Sanibel area along like the West Florida, Naples location, and they had this thing called a meteo tsunami. So what's the difference between that and a regular tsunami?
So a meteo tsunami is something, it's a weather phenomena, triggers something that it's not as well understood, but my understanding of it, and I'm not a meteorologist by any stretch, is that a line or a squall, something, I think some of them are called a derecha. Don't quote me on that, but it's something, a line or a squall moving across the continent could also then come across the water and come down on the surface of the water and displace water coming toward the coast. So I think these are really rare that the right conditions can form, but it's something that can happen.
Kevin, Ricky here. I'm going to jump in with a question. What are some of the most famous tsunamis, or one of the more recent tsunamis that have impacted the United States coastline?
There are a couple that stand out. And the most recent one was the Tohoku, Japan earthquake and tsunami that occurred in March 2011. And of course, that devastated Japan, northern Japan. But then it came across, it caused some damage in Hawaii as well as in California, actually about $100 million in property damage to coastal infrastructure. Unfortunately, one person died who went down to the mouth of a river mouth, the Klamath River in far northern California. And the wave surges actually came behind a spit of land that person was on. And they washed up actually a month later, about 300 miles north in northern Oregon. So we want to avoid any loss of life, of course, and we have taken lessons from that tsunami and others and put it into everything that we do. Prior to that, there had been our most notable tsunami was from 1964 from the Great Alaska Earthquake, and that destroyed the waterfront in Crescent City, California. Did some damage. It actually killed 12 people in California. And so that was a significant tsunami. We've had about 6 that have triggered the emergency alert system or emergency actions in California in the last 9 years. But most of those are not going to be, or they haven't been inundating tsunamis. They typically impact water infrastructure, but we have procedures in place for any severity of tsunami.
Along the west coast of the United States, is there a more significant risk for Hawaii or the west coast?
Well, it's different. The west coast has a very high risk north of Cape Mendocino, California, all the way up to Vancouver Island because of the Cascadia subduction zone that stretches between those 2 locations immediately offshore. South of Cape Mendocino in California, our most significant risk is from a distant event coming from the Aleutians Arc in Alaska. That's the portion of that island chain that would be pointed directly at California. And similarly for Hawaii, they kind of view themselves as a bullseye in the middle of the Pacific, and they can get hit from one of these distant events coming from a subduction zone from around the Pacific. They don't have as much threat locally.
And then let's shift gears to the other coast here. How about the East Coast of the United States? A lot of us live on the coast and probably don't ever think about the threat of a tsunami here. But as you mentioned earlier, every coastline has some threat, correct?
That's right. I think it's considered we work closely with all states and territories. So we have colleagues who work on this issue on the East Coast. There are threats from the Canary Islands and from the Puerto Rico Trench, potentially triggering a distant event for the East Coast. The coastline on the East Coast is much there's a much wider shelf, and so there's certainly a threat of inundation there, and it's going to be certainly from a distant source.
If there were to be a tsunami on the East Coast, what would it kind of look like? Would it be kind of similar to some of our hurricanes and storm surge with the water levels, or would it, I guess, vary depending on the type of earthquake and or landslide or whatever occurred?
Yeah, I think you could draw a somewhat of an analogy with hurricane, storm surge. Each one of these events is going to be somewhat different in terms of the amount of water moved, the direction it's coming from, and so and even whether you're going to have a positive or a negative wave based on whether the source dropped down or uplifted ahead of to push the water, or drew it out. What we're the way that this has been addressed is to create inundation maps using modeling, because we don't have a long history of these events within recorded history, and taking the models and the combination of those models, drawing a worst case line beyond which no inundation is expected from any one scenario coming from around the Pacific. And that's the best way to provide information that people can use to plan how far they need to go inland if one of these events occurs.
You mentioned positive versus negative wave. I'm not sure I've ever heard that term before. Can you explain what that is?
Basically, there are 3 natural warning signs for a tsunami. If you feel strong shaking and you're at the coast, you want to potentially move to high ground. If you hear abnormal ocean roar, or something that you're not used to hearing and you're familiar with the ocean there. And the third one is whether you see water draw out abnormally far. And the flip side of that is the water would rush in first. So that's what I mean by negative versus positive.
Hey, Kevin, I guess one of the more recent major tsunamis that's hit the continent was the March 11th, or March of 2011 earthquake that happened in the Pacific Ocean, caused a tsunami in Japan. So that's the most images. We saw a lot of video on YouTube and social media and things like that. Can you talk to us a little bit about that tsunami and what made it so catastrophic, and maybe how videos and cell phones and things like that really portrayed this event to be bigger, but also I'm sure it gave some evidence to folks who may have got that warning to actually see the tsunami coming in. So can you talk a little bit about that major tsunami that we saw in Japan back in 2011?
Sure. Well, that event was a 9.0, one of the largest recorded earthquakes, and the displacement that they saw in the trench off of northern Japan was huge. It moved, I think, 50. It moved about 50 feet along the fault, and along a long length of the fault ruptured. And so it created a much larger tsunami than they had planned for or expected in Japan. They have 1,000 years of basically they got their 1,000-year event. And the planning that they had done was, some of the mapping was looking at events that had occurred in the 1800s. And so because of their long history, they had looked back to some smaller tsunamis that they had experienced. So they have since revised their evacuation lines, moving them much further inland. Some of their evacuation structures, they have created a lot of barriers and vertical evacuation structures, and people survived in some of those. And some of them, the emergency managers and the city officials climbed to the top of a multi-story building, which was then overtopped, and a lot of them didn't make it. They had barriers that they had built to block tsunamis, and those were overtopped as well. So they had a significant loss of life, I think up to somewhere between 18 and 23,000 people. But between 95 and 100% of the people survived. There were very few people who were impacted or died because of the earthquake. Most of the deaths were because of tsunamis. So that event was huge for Japan. You're right. It was like March 11th, 2011, and they consider that their 9/11 is 3/11. So that one traveled 10 hours to get across to California.
Yeah, I want to get in here and just ask, for folks at home that find interest in tsunamis, especially after you have these big earthquakes out in the oceans. How can they track tsunamis from their home?
There's a few websites that you can get information about your maps and your local threat. So we've developed one called tsunamizone.org, which has a lot of preparedness information. And then in terms of understanding a live tsunami as it's unfolding, you can go to tsunami.gov, tsunami.gov. And that's the Tsunami Warning Centers. There's the National Tsunami Warning Center in Alaska and the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center in Hawaii. And they're tracking earthquakes around the world constantly, continuously. And if something, if there's a large earthquake, they're going to be looking at that to see if it's potentially tsunamigenic. They also have a system of deep ocean assessment buoys, about 60 of these buoys in the open ocean that have a pressure sensor that can detect about a centimeter of movement in the ocean. And these events, they are able to trigger or receive information from these buoys. So they'll, if a large earthquake occurs, one of these, the National Tsunami Warning Center or the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center will be analyzing that event. They'll be sending out information. They'll be running models, and they'll be tracking the buoys to confirm that an event has occurred, and then sending out information via their website and through various means, email, Twitter, and texting, both to the public and to emergency managers.
Kevin, the National Weather Service, obviously they have a advisory watch warning program that they do. It seems like NOAA, the Tsunami Warning Centers, they also have that type of criteria. Can you talk to us a little bit about the advisory watches warnings process for tsunamis? And then I also want to piggyback off that and talk about what you guys do. I know there in California you have your own mitigation, your own plan when these things are issued.
Sure. So the national or the tsunami warning centers both use the same alert system as the rest of the weather service. It's 4 different levels. A warning is the most severe, and a warning in this case for a tsunami means they expect inundation, and the action is evacuate the mapped inundation area. An advisory is also a life-threatening alert, and it's designed for those that are on the water and near the water. Because these events are occurring in the water, they can trigger dangerous, deadly, unnavigable currents. They can destroy harbor infrastructure that's not designed to withstand these currents that are coming in and out every 20 to 30 minutes. And so the recommendation from an advisory is to get off and away from the water. And then there's a 3rd level, which is a watch. And in the case of tsunamis, that means for your section of coast, the analysis is being run, models are being run and stay tuned. Stay tuned, and they'll either upgrade you or downgrade you to being safe. And the fourth level is an information statement, which means there's been a significant earthquake in the Pacific or the Atlantic, typically something above a 7 or a 7.5. But a tsunami is not expected. It's not a tsunamigenic earthquake. So when we get one of those alerts, then our 20 coastal counties, I'll speak from the example of California and recent tsunamis that have triggered one of these alerts, then the National Tsunami Warning Center at the federal level will convene a conference call. In our case, we deal with the National Tsunami Warning Center in Alaska, who's responsible for alerting North America. And so they'll convene a call of the potentially affected state coastlines. And they'll convene that call every hour as long as there's a threat. And we'll take that information and convene a call following emergency management protocol down the chain with our coastal counties. We have 20 of those in California. And that's basically to provide a couple of pieces, 3 key pieces of information. When is the tsunami expected to impact our coastline? How big is it going to be? And what are the local conditions? And we also look at this as an opportunity. We have eyes on the coast from our local emergency managers to be able to either provide information or ask questions. And then since these are tricky events and they're really impacted by the coastline, the topography, the amount of water, the directivity, the size of the earthquake, the distance away from the source, there may be heightened areas. For instance, in Crescent City in California, we know that's an area of heightened concern for many of these events. So that the response strategy is an opportunity to hone in on areas that may need additional information, and then talking with the federal government up the chain and local emergency or government officials down the chain provides a good information flow.
Kevin, we had a viewer question come in from Kathleen. She lives in South Carolina, and Charleston, South Carolina has a large earthquake history, a long earthquake history.
Yes.
Would a major quake in the Charleston area pose a tsunami risk?
There's a potential, like I said, for landslides or some movement. So it's not out of the question. I don't know the specifics, to be honest with you, of the Charleston coastline and whether there are, like in California, if we have cliffs next to the ocean, that's a potential for a landslide or something to drop into the water and cause a problem. But as far as a subduction zone earthquake, like I was talking about off of Japan, I was going to mention that that's not necessarily a threat for most areas in the continental United States, aside from the Pacific Northwest or Northern California, Oregon, and Washington.
So to kind of sum it up, perhaps more of a basic scale, the tsunami risk is mainly caused by earthquakes that have an epicenter centered over water and not one that would be like just a couple miles inland from South Carolina, perhaps?
That's right. That's yeah. Like I said, the potential if one occurs under land would be if it triggered a landslide.
Gotcha. Perfect. So last question here. We are coming up on Tsunami Awareness Week and Tsunami Preparedness Week. Talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about what people can do to get ready if they live on the coast and they are under a tsunami threat.
Sure. Tsunami Preparedness Week is something that the National Weather Service supports, and it's tsunami preparedness in California is March 25th through 29th. So there are websites that we have created, tsunamizone.org, and people can go there and look for activities, whether it's a local talk or an awareness fair. One of the the best type of events that we see are people or groups or families or communities who know where their hazard inundation zone is, and they'll undertake what they call a tsunami walk, and a group of people will walk from a point on the coast to a point of high ground, and so that's kind of a good way to get the muscle memory going, to figure out what your route to safety might be, so that you don't have to figure that out in the middle of the night when you get an alert or some kind of notification. And we found that worked well in our tsunami potentially prone areas in Crescent City, Del Norte County, the northernmost county in California. Practiced this drill during Tsunami Preparedness Week the year prior to the Japan event. And then when they were put into a warning for the first time in California's history, using that protocol, they felt okay about evacuating at 3 a.m. Everyone said it felt like a drill. So those kinds of activities are things that are available to be seen on the website, and it's an opportunity for the state and local government officials to acknowledge the hazard and encourage everyone to go and take a look and see if they understand where their hazard is. There's a couple of websites where you can type in an address and determine whether you're in or out of a tsunami inundation zone, and then get some pointers on ways that you can start to understand your hazard and prepare. And it's pretty simple to do. To understand what to do once you know where your hazard is. It's just to protect yourself from any local shaking, and then get to high ground and then stay there.
Awesome information. One last question that I kind of just thought of. So let's say somebody has an interest in tsunamis or earthquakes. What's some of the ways they can get involved in this field and perhaps contribute to research in the future?
Well, there's a lot of resources on that particular web page. There are links to the National Weather Service has a lot of scientists, but there are a lot that we work with in state, local, and federal government who work on this hazard. We're hiring somebody in the near future, so you can go to any number of probably government websites and type in the word tsunami and see what comes up in terms of jobs. But there are it's a scientific field, so large scientific conferences like the American Geophysical Union has topics and sessions on this kind of information where students can get their work that they have published and worked on recognized and discussed, and so I think getting into it's something you can study in school and something you can apply for in the field.
Well, Kevin, we appreciate it. I have one last question for you. I know
Sure.
Here in the Southeast, hurricanes are big things. A lot of emergency managers prepare for hurricanes. They do simulations and their EOCs. How do you guys go about this? Do you do a yearly activity or maybe every couple of months activity to make sure everyone in California, not only the citizens, but also emergency management and local law enforcement stuff are ready for tsunamis?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. We do. As the centerpiece of tsunami preparedness in our most tsunami-prone area in far northern California a few years ago, they started doing what they call a tsunami warning communications drill test. And so that's a systems test, different from an evacuation drill with people. This tests the system from end to end. And it was kind of a pioneering effort to start to do this, taking live alert codes coming from the National Tsunami Warning Center and getting permission from the Federal Communications Commission to use these to be able to activate sirens on the coast where those exist, and put the scroll through the emergency alert system on television screens that say a tsunami warning, and then a voiceover would say this is a test. So that has been a systems test that is it's really good to make sure everything works. And I think the catalyst behind that was on a Pacific island somewhere, somebody pushed a button when an actual tsunami was occurring, and the message that came out was, this is a test. So they want to make sure all the equipment is working, all the messaging is working, and if something fails, then it's still considered a success, because we learned that that piece of equipment or communications protocol or personnel protocol didn't work. And so we wanted certainly test that out during a drill as opposed to during the real event.
That's some great information. Well, Kevin, we'll kind of close if you don't mind, a couple of those websites that you had mentioned, how folks can stay tuned with this, and if you have any other links or social media accounts that folks can follow, we'd love for you to promote those as well.
Oh yeah, of course. We created a tsunamizone.org as kind of a central repository or go-to place for preparedness information. The alert and warning piece of it that's happening if a real tsunami is happening is tsunami.gov, and tsunami.ca.gov is California's some of the research and development that has occurred in California.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that. Kevin, we appreciate your time. I know it was kind of a hectic afternoon, so appreciate you being with us tonight, and we hope that next week goes well with the preparations, and hopefully it's a pretty quiet year for you there in California.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
No problem. All right. Well, I'm going to toss it to James Brierton. James, along with some of our other panelists, was able to get together with our good friends, the Sirens Project, who you saw a little tease earlier in the show. And James, you guys had a great interview last night talking about all the things that they've been able to do down in the South.
Yeah, that's right, Scotty. A little bit earlier in the show, we reintroduced you to our friends at the Sirens Project, an Atlanta-based storm chaser group who, if you recall from the show we did with them last year, used drones to collect data and monitor storms. They went down to Lee County, Alabama, to help the folks devastated by the recent tornadoes there. And we started our interview last night by asking them, as Atlanta-based storm chasers, why did they feel compelled to go back to the hardest hit areas to help out those residents?
Well, basically, Chris can attest to this too. We were all chasing that day, and it was pretty early on when that supercell developed. We started getting reports of extreme damage and even a casualty situation. And we've done in the past help with Florence, Hurricane Florence in North Carolina, and Hurricane Matthew in the Panhandle, and so this disaster relief aspect of our projects, really starting to get some traction, and we're feeling, more and more compelled to do it.
We had breakfast all together over at the Renaissance at the airport in Atlanta the morning of. Just, I guess, walk the audience through how that day unfolded for you guys, I guess, during the day and where you were and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so basically, like Chris said, we started out in Atlanta, and then we started driving south towards Columbus, Georgia, and then it kind of seemed like more isolated supercell development was going to start taking place further to the south towards Dothan and in Leary, Alabama, those smaller towns. And so we followed Chris for a while, and the ambulance isn't the fastest vehicle in the world, so at some point we kind of had to go our separate ways. We actually missed the Beauregard, Alabama tornado. We were focusing on the isolated cells further to the south. They went tornado warned. The two to the south that we were on went tornado warned. Didn't see any tornadoes. From what we could tell, a lot of it was definitely rain wrapped. The area of circulation and the area of interest, I guess you could say, was pretty rain wrapped. But yeah, the Mavic definitely gave us an edge to be able to see over the tree line and stuff like that. But on the drive home, it was just kind of like you know, we're going to be back out here, and we need to be back out here to help these people. So that's kind of how our day unfolded anyways.
You know, with the rain that was ongoing at the time and stuff, I didn't want to chase rain-wrapped tornadoes across that kind of landscape. And, you know, going south, it all works out. And, you know, just glad I got to meet you guys, and you guys were able to do, you know, some great work. But I kick it over to Melissa or Evan.
So I know in addition to the video that you've watched, you guys have provided with some images, one of them being this really just amazing image of this home structure that has been completely just leveled. There's just this wall that seems to be standing. Can you tell us a little bit about coming across some of the damage that you actually saw, and you know, what is there a story behind this particular image?
The second day is when we actually went into Beauregard to do work. And the damage there, I mean, it was, you could definitely tell it was EF4. I mean, it was very, very intense, a lot different than what we saw further east. And we actually came across this house. It looked very interesting. You know, the foundation's completely cleaned off, and there's really nothing left at all on that slab except for that one outer wall standing, which was actually the front of the house. And we were able to talk to one of the relatives of the 4 people who survived in that house. And he was kind of telling us the story. It was all his cousins and nieces, I think. There's 4 people that took shelter in that house. And it's just incredible that, you know, the wall that they were taking shelter against was the only wall in the entire house that stood. And what's interesting about that house, that street actually saw a lot of fatalities. There's about 10 fatalities on that street, including next door neighbors to that house and across the street. But that house is actually one of the reasons why the tornado was rated at EF4. It was a properly built home. It was 2 code, and there's a little bit of background on that house construction on Tim Marshall's Facebook page. And so it was a properly poured slab, and the walls are bolted to the concrete, but it just kind of goes to show that, I mean, that truly was a very intense tornado. And the fact that those 4 people were able to survive, I mean, that's a huge blessing for them, for sure. And, you know, it's really just one of those moments where you kind of get overwhelmed almost by how powerful the storms really are. It really puts things into perspective.
Leah, I wanted to ask you a question. So what are your purposes and your goals in doing this post-storm response?
So our goals are just deliver supplies, whatever families need, identify what that need is, and give them what they need. A lot of it's just food, water, and clothing. So that's our number 1 goal, is to get down there and to see what's needed and provide what's needed. But then another goal is to kind of just clean up and help wherever we can. If that's going out and searching for family photos, and that's what we're going to do, and that's what we did the second day. The first day, we actually cut down trees and moved it to the road, because the county will only take within 20 feet of the property. They'll clean up anything that's within that 20 feet radius. So you have to get all the trees down there. So those are the 2 main goals, is the supply drop and then just helping out wherever we can.
We have one more additional photo. It shows a dry lake bed that you guys were able to capture from your drone, and your drone that you use for storm chasing captures some really compelling images, but also has a mission, as I understand it, to capture data. So what from this event were you guys able to walk away with regards to images and data?
The data that we are after is you know, barometric pressure, relative humidity, temperature, those sorts of things. But also our goal is to eventually be able to map in 3-dimensional space wind direction and speed using basically what the inputs from the drone, or what the drone is responding to in the atmosphere. And this will hopefully allow us to sample wind speed and direction in the forward flank, you know, of the storm, where there's not a lot of understanding what's happening in the supercell there. And the main component that we're after is vertical wind speed. And hopefully that the drone will be able to tell us a little bit about, you know, what's going on in that portion of the thunderstorm. But to go further on the lake bed, this was actually when I first saw this in person, I was pretty taken aback. I mean, this this right here, according to the locals, was a very popular fishing pond, stocked full of fish, and kind of everybody in the community would come around and fish that on a nice day. And this thing, it was slap full of water. I mean, to the brim. And after this tornado had passed, I mean, the damage path literally crosses the center of circulation, crossed over this lake, and it is essentially completely dry. And so effectively the tornado had removed all of the water in this lake. And that was really incredible. And the locals said they couldn't even believe it too, when they kind of got their bearings after what had happened and realized, oh my gosh, the lake is completely dry now, and it's just pretty incredible. Like your average swimming pool's, 5,000 gallons or so, or 5,300 gallons. And so you can imagine this, several square acre amount of water just being completely pulled out of where it was resting is pretty incredible.
And that's some really awesome stuff, guys. And before we wrap this up, I just want to give you guys a chance to plug all your social media stuff. And if folks want to follow you, how can they do that?
Oh yeah, so our website is thesirensproject.com, and that's where we have a lot of more in-depth, I guess, kind of synopsis on our trips and on our projects, and it's constantly being updated now. And on Facebook, that's www.facebook.com/The Sirens Project. You can follow us on Instagram @Sirens Project and on Twitter @Sirens Project. So, yeah, it's basically the best way to kind of follow us along.
Awesome. And one more quick thing before we wrap this up. With your community relief efforts, are you guys partnering with any local organizations when you do stuff like this, or is it just kind of we're going head this up ourselves?
I guess it's kind of a little bit of both. So we like to really work closely with local churches, and that's kind of our main go-to. That's who His Hands Church in Woodstock is who supplied us for this trip, and I mean the response was overwhelming. The video talks a little bit about it, but I mean we just had 9,800 pounds of water. I mean just tons of canned food, and everything like that. But and that's on the supply side, but also on the more direct relief side, these local churches in these communities typically become the central hub, and they communicate very closely with the EMA and the forestry divisions of the county or of the state. And so churches are really our go-to kind of thing, because they generally supply a place to stay as well, which is really important. And one thing that we're trying to focus on is being a more immediate response, trying to be there as quickly as possible. It kind of goes in hand with storm chasing. If we're that close to the storms initially, our hope is that we will be able to have a response time that's very, very fast. Hopefully these smaller teams that we can put together can actually go into these areas a lot quicker. And that's kind of our main goal, is to be there as it happens or very shortly after. So.
Oh, that's great, man. Well, I want to thank you guys so much for taking the time to join us. And, we really appreciate it. And I know the community appreciates everything that you guys are doing to, help in relief after the fact. Just to have folks that are willing to take the time out of their lives to help others is really awesome. So thanks so much. And personally, anytime we're ready to chase again, let me know.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Absolutely.
Awesome.
And that was our interview with the Sirens Project. Thanks to Warren, Brent, and Leah for their time. Now, if you want to learn more about the Sirens Project, we have a couple options for you. You heard their social media channels right there. We're also going to be uploading an extended version of that interview to our Patreon page for our patrons who help support and fund the Carolina Weather Group. And we did an entire show about the Sirens Project last year, and we're going to be re-airing that this Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern on the Carolina Weather Group Facebook channel, or you can find it right now on our YouTube channel. Let's bring the panel back in, and Scotty, they're doing some really great work there.
Yeah, it is. It's really cool too. I'd love to go out and storm chase with them. So maybe, Chris, we can maybe arrange that. That would be pretty cool to go out.
That's already done. That's a done deal.
Speaking of storms, thankfully, severe weather has kind of calmed down here in the southeast over the past a week or so. But we do have some weather affecting the area. I don't know, James, if you can hear me right now, but maybe we can pull up radar. And we're watching a developing low pressure off of the coast of the Carolinas. That should track just inland overnight throughout the day tomorrow, and that's going to push some rain showers into eastern North Carolina and possibly even back into the Charlotte metro area. And Ricky, I'll bring you in too. We're also watching a cold front move across the Arkansas, Tennessee area. That'll be affecting you guys first and then into western North Carolina. So we couldn't really make it a whole week without rain, it seems like.
No, but it's been a nice little stretch. Hey, you know, another thing about that coastal storm there is that they're seeing some increased tide levels too. In addition to the area low pressure, of course, the big super moon, woof, death, whatever they call it for this month's moon, ongoing. I think my dog just barked at the moon. That was ironic. But anyway, so that's going on tonight. So they are seeing some coastal flooding along the South Carolina coastline and parts of North Carolina as well. So thinking about that, and yeah, as you mentioned, that cold front swings through late tomorrow in our area. That brings in some cooler air, especially for the overnight hours. Days won't be too bad. It's coming through with some upper level cold air as well, so it'd be interesting to see if we get any elevated instability, maybe a little bit of small hail out of some of the showers or isolated rumbles of thunder tomorrow as that front does come through. And then evident in my area, and again, parts of western North Carolina, we may see some northwest flow snow. I think in my area, White Top, Rome Mountain, Greece and Highlands area, you'll probably see some of the bigger, higher amounts for snow totals, but could be about a day or maybe even 2 days back to back of some northwest flow snow.
Yeah, agreed. I might fight you a little bit for Roan Mountain. That's one of my favorite places in western North Carolina or eastern Tennessee, depending on what side of the ridge you're on. Definitely could be seeing some snow totals. I'll pull up a quick map. I think this is definitely overblown in terms of there will be no 15 inches of snow anywhere across the Smokies. But there is potential for a few inches of snow up above, maybe 1 to 2 inches of snow up above 5,000 feet. Maybe some pockets of some more if this northwest flow does continue for more than 24 hours, upwards to 2 days, maybe even into Saturday, early Saturday morning. But that part of it isn't very set in stone yet. But we're definitely going to be looking at stronger winds on Friday and that northwest fetch Thursday night, and kind of that moisture fading a little bit into Friday, maybe picking back up later on.
And Ricky, it's funny. I'll bring you and I were talking before the show started. This upcoming weekend is the Martinsville NASCAR race, and we just think about back to last year, and we had a pretty big snow event there. So it's really not uncommon to have snow events, especially in the mountains and even parts of the foothills and Piedmont into late March.
No, and if I forget if the Martinsville race was this early last year or if it was later. But yeah, when we've seen snow, sleet, some freezing rain all the way into April in my area. So I always tell people, don't plant your stuff until basically after tax day, because we can certainly get some cooler events in our area. March 26th was the STP 500 last year. So you're right. Basically right around this time, Martinsville is where they had that big snowstorm. We didn't see a whole lot in the Tri-Cities area, but areas of Roanoke into parts of western North Carolina towards, I want to say Winston-Salem got a good amount of snow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Greensboro. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that was certainly a bigger March snow, but we've seen big March snows. So, hey, never say it's over until it's July.
I seen James had the models going, and we were talking about there's been some internet rumors of potentially seeing some snow even affecting parts of the Carolinas. Even I think at one time the models are showing some coastal snow, but like you talked about, it's really hard to get snow outside of the mountains, and we're here kind of right now to at least to kind of squash that rumor. It looks like it may be just kind of a cold rain next week, early next week.
Yeah, and even that moisture that was being picked up by the models is shown there on that. I think this is the NAM you've got pulled up there. Mm-hmm. So if you go forward here in time, here comes the front. Some wraparound moisture comes through, and here we go into what is late Friday into early Saturday. You see some of that moisture popping up there across the Delmarva Peninsula and there's parts of Virginia. The GFS and some other models that aren't as high res as the NAM is when we get this far out, we're picking up on that. And I think just the course resolution problems were throwing some snow out because we had the moisture. It was such a wide area, and it was like, I'll just change everything to snow instead of having it be now shown as rain. So
this is the GFS now for clarification as people are following along at home.
Don't trust the model so much long term, especially when it comes to snow.
That's right. I think we're all ready for spring. This is the start of spring, at least astronomical spring. Meteorological spring starts on March 1st. But we will end tonight's show. Before that, before we end tonight's show, I want to say we continue Weather Podcast Month, and next week we're going to have on Dr. John Scala from the Weather Brains, and he's going to be joining us along with Mark Johnson from Stormfront Freaks. And we're just going to have a kind of a roundtable discussion. I want to bring Chris in here because, Chris, you were able to represent us. We, all of us on this panel, we love Weather Brains. Weather Brains is the kind of laid the foundation of weather podcasts. He was able to join Mr. James Spann and Bill Murray and all the gang over the on Monday evening. How did that go?
It was great. Great discussion. There was 10 people, on their show the other night, and I was lucky enough to be one of them. And we continue to have a great conversation about what to do in the South across Dixie Alley with the rash of tornadoes, and especially these killer tornadoes that affect areas that are a lot more vulnerable to widespread damage and even fatalities, as we've seen, unfortunately. But it's a great conversation. As long as these conversations continue, I think it's going to do nothing but help everybody across the entire weather enterprise. But they were great, top notch, love them to death. They told me I'd come back anytime.
Yeah, a great group. I know myself and Ricky has been able to be on the Weather Brains program. So if you want to learn more about National Weather Podcast Month, you can Google the website. It'll give you a schedule of all the rundown of all the shows that's already happened, those coming up. And you can also follow them on Twitter at WX Podcast Month, and you can follow along with the National Weather Podcast Month. So we hope we encourage you to follow those folks and check out some weather shows, and join us next week as we kind of conclude National Weather Podcast Month. We're going to have just an open discussion talking about weather podcasts and whatever else is going on in the weather world. So we hope you will join us then. But as I was talking to earlier, this is the first day of spring. And so as we close tonight, Chris Jackson was out and about today getting some beautiful scenes of how spring has sprung in Columbia, South Carolina. You guys have a great evening.